Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm Alex Epstein. The title of today's episode is When It's Difficult to Get Started. So the basis of this, or the motivation for this, is that, as I think I've discussed on previous episodes, there are certain activities in life that are very valuable, and that once we're in the middle of them, they're fairly easy and even enjoyable to sustain, but getting started can be difficult. So one example, which is kind of a simple example, but an important one, is you might have had this experience, you probably have it on some level, like getting into a cold pool or a cold ocean, where at the beginning it feels like, oh, it's super cold, it's hard to do, there's a lot of resistance to confronting it, but once you're in it for a minute or two, it feels great. And you may even want to stay in for a long time. At least this is how I feel. Another example that is very close to me is writing. You'll hear a lot of people who engage in writing talk about, okay, once I'm in the zone, it's easy or enjoyable, or it can maybe even I don't want to leave it. But getting into it can be hard. It can be so intimidating to start something, particularly if it's a big project. There's all sorts of resistance and reasons not to do it. And then procrastination can happen, and so on and so on. And I'm sure there are many, many examples from different people's lives. And there's just this phenomenon of sometimes the activity that we really think is good for us can be difficult to initiate. Another one that just came to mind for me, it's maybe different for others, is processing my email. So that's something where I have a lot of resistance to doing it, but once I get into it, I can get into it, and then I might not even want to leave it. But this relates to a topic I'll probably discuss on a different episode, which is, and maybe I'll discuss it a little bit this episode actually, at the end, and it's about proper time allocation, how important it is to allocate the right amount of time for things. So I find that for me, a really good block of time is 2 hours. I find that if I allocate 2 hours for something like that, once I get into it, then I can really be on a roll. Whereas if I allocate 45 minutes, then by the time I could even be on a roll, it's almost over. And then that can lead to delaying the start of it if I know it's only 45 minutes. But more on that a little bit later. So I think it's very valuable insofar as we can figure out what are good ways to get started on valuable activities when it's difficult. And I'll start out with 3 things that I'm not going to focus on today, but all of which are very valuable. Then I'm going to focus on 2 approaches, and above all, 1 approach that may be useful in addition to these first 3. So 1 is habit formation. So that's just making something a habit. And that can be something like, well, with writing, the more you write, all things being equal, the less resistance there will be. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be resistance. And if you ever read the book, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, which is a really interesting book, he talks about how, resistance is chronic. But I think even he would say that over time, it gets to be less. If you're doing something day in, day out, you get more confidence in it. And even though there may be some resistance, it's not the same as if you're totally new to it and it's super intimidating. And this is true of anything. Going in the ocean, I find, it's easier. I've been taking more cold showers lately with Wim Hof method, which I'll talk a little bit about maybe in one of these, when I make one of these, the upcoming points. And, that's just the kind of thing that, the more you do it, the easier it gets to be to initiate. And one term I've heard for this, which I learned from Eben Pagan, although I don't think he came up with it. So Eben Pagan, I've talked about him in previous episodes. He's really a smart entrepreneur who has a lot of insight about a lot of things, including productivity. So I learned the term habit gravity from him, which is that it's, at the beginning, before you've developed a habit, there's a certain kind of gravity toward your old habit. So if you want to get up and go to the gym in the morning, then there's this gravity, there's this pull of your habit of not doing that. And at a certain point, you can break that habit gravity if you repeat the new habit enough times. Then it becomes a habit, and you'll hear different things like, oh, it takes 21 days or 30 days or 60 days. And I've never studied the different things, but so no doubt that habit formation is quite useful. But I think most of us would say it's still often the case that even when we're in the habit, there can be a lot of resistance to things. So a second thing, which is related to overcoming the resistance, is willpower. And for our purposes today, this is pretty simple. As in, I just say, okay, I have this resistance, and I'm just gonna will myself. So I'm gonna will myself to go in the cold shower. I'm gonna will myself to start writing. Whatever it is, I'm just going to will myself. And this obviously has a lot of value, but it has its limitations, including people talk about, I think accurately, the idea that you have a finite amount of willpower, that you can't just be willing everything all the time. And so it's the kind of thing where you'd rather not have, ideally you'd like to have a set of daily habits where willpower isn't necessary for the norm, because then you can use it for exceptional things. So for example, I use the example of writing because I know it very well, but it's similar to a lot of other kinds of work. If it's super hard for me to even get started writing and I have burning up willpower on that, then I'm going to have, I guess, according to this limited willpower idea, which is very plausible to me, then when I actually encounter a difficulty within writing that I need to push through, it'll be that much more difficult because I'll have burned so much getting into it. So if it's just a regular thing that's good for me, I would like to have less willpower. Doesn't mean I'll ever get to zero, but I'm going to talk about how to significantly lessen it in a minute. But the third one, before I get into that, is, and this is a broad category and another very valuable category, is condition setting. So I set up the conditions so it's easier to get started. And this is a broad idea, so you can think of it in as expansive a way as you want in terms of what are the different conditions that will make it easier. So it might be, if you're talking about work or writing, it might be, okay, well, I'm going to make my office neat. That'll help me write. Or I'll have a really comfortable chair. For me, I like writing and editing on I often do it on a couch, in part because it helps me think about the audience. And I do it I like working on an iPad, including when I'm typing, because the closeness to my eyes and something about the keyboard I find much more comfortable, because the regular Mac keyboard is always rubbing against my wrist, which I really dislike. But also it's just there's something about the closeness of it. The iPad, at least I use the 2017 iPad Pro, and keyboard, has all kinds of issues, and the keyboards are always disconnecting and stuff, and the Apple pencils are messed up, but in certain ways. But that's a condition that really makes it easier for me versus working directly on a laptop. So they're all different kinds of things, and your motivation can be conditioned. So it could even be, okay, in the morning, I'm going to read this thing. That's going to get me motivated. You just think about it as, and I could do a whole episode on this. I don't think I have so far. Before I did Human Flourishing Project, I did some videos on YouTube, I think, about conditions. If you look up the video Resolution Revolution, I might talk there about different kinds of conditions. But one way to think about conditions as a prompt is to just think, and I got this also from Eben Pagan, he talks about inevitability thinking. So you think about, what conditions would I need to put in place for this to be inevitable? And that can be really, really powerful and spark a lot of creativity. Okay, so let's jump into the ones that I want to focus on. The main idea I want to focus on in terms of making it easier to get started on a valuable activity that's hard to start is engineering the activity to be easier to start. So engineering the activity to be easier to start. So I'll give you an example. I was working on this week that sparked this show. So I mentioned in the last show, which was on a proactive approach to health, that I was exploring what's called the Wim Hof method, WIM space HOF. So really interesting guy, and it involves a certain kind of breathing and then a certain kind of exposure to cold. And one thing I liked about it when I tried it was a pretty quick way to get like rejuvenated and energized in the morning. And it was quite high probability. So I could do it and I would very reliably get a certain kind of rejuvenation. I've definitely found that to be the case, having done it every day since I did that last episode. But one thing I was noticing with the Wim Hof breathing is so in some ways it's easier to get started than other things. I think it's a little bit easier than meditation to get started, at least for me, but it still involves a certain amount of effort. And I was finding myself like, okay, yeah, do I want to, like, I was finding myself having a little bit of resistance to it. So then I thought, okay, what would be the easiest possible way to get started on this? Because I knew that once I got started, it involves often multiple rounds of a certain kind of breathing with breath holds in between. And I noticed that, okay, well, after the first round, it's way easier to do more because I'm in it and I feel really good. And I've just experienced the reward of doing it. And for me, the most pleasurable part is the breath hold is actually the most pleasurable part. And then you take an inhale after the breath hold, which is also really enjoyable. But it's just this very calm and nice state with the breath hold if you set it up with the breathing. So I thought, okay, how do I get into that? And I thought, well, just for me, the beginning of it and the guided meditation on YouTube, it's just a little bit fast. So I find that I like to do it more slowly at the beginning and get my technique in line and just really do it in a relaxed way. And then I can speed up later if I want. And I just found that, okay, yeah, this is considerably easier to do and more pleasant to do, because then I just have to go lie down somewhere and just start breathing in a relaxing way. So it can almost be a lazy thing, which I like initiating activities in a lazy way if I can, as long as I know that this is in line with inevitability, thinking like inevitably it's going to get me into a state where it's easy to continue. And I noticed that Wim Hof talks about this explicitly with regard to cold, because he's big on cold, but he says you need to really gradually expose yourself. So he has a video on getting in the cold, and he's just saying, don't force anything, just, get your extremities wet and then get your shoulders wet. And even you can start off hot. And notice a lot of the practitioners, they'll start off with a hot shower or a warm shower, and then they'll move in, and it's easier to do. And as long as they can get to the cold part, then they've done it. But it's a much easier way. Now, maybe over time, there are reasons why you don't want to start, but then you don't want to start cold, but then you don't want to start warm rather, but then hopefully you've built up a certain tolerance. And maybe sometimes it is a situation where you deliberately want to do the thing that takes a lot of will, but this is an example of where it can be a lot easier. So other things so I think the question, the operating question that I want to share today, and I can share more examples, but the operating question is, what is the easiest way to get started on this thing? So if I'm thinking about something that can be hard to start, what is the easiest way of getting started? And part of this is asking, at what point in the activity does it become easy to sustain? So I find if I'm going in cold water, like once my head has gone underwater, it is easy to sustain. And certainly, once I start moving around, it's pretty easy to sustain. It's a lot easier for me than going in. And I find that with, say, doing email, this may be a controversial one that I do, but this is kind of associated, I think, with being sort of a distracted student. But this is the only thing I do this with that I can think of. Actually, some admin tasks too. It might be I might start a TV thing in the background on it. And then what'll happen is I'll just become annoyed by the TV thing. But it's just, I have a resistance to doing email, and I have resistance to certain kinds of admin things. So part of what I can do is just have something that makes it palatable for a few minutes, and then I get into it, and then I'm starting to enjoy the efficacy. But part of it is I know the mechanics of how I work. I like, once I'm on a roll, and I'll talk about this in a second, once I have enough of a time block allocated to something, then I can really move forward. But it's all about knowing, and this will obviously vary person to person, at what point in the activity does it become easy to sustain? And then I might as well just figure out how to bridge that as quickly as possible. So what's the easiest way to do things? I think people do this in different ways. Now, sometimes you might have like eating a treat, although I think food-based ones can be problematic because that can lead to other issues. It also can lead to depriving oneself of energy. But if it's something I really want to do regularly and well, I would like it to be as easy as possible. I'm doing some stretching for some physical therapy, and one thing I think about is, okay, it's easier to do that. Like I can start out doing that in bed. I think a lot of times people have issues, and I sometimes have issues with just like, okay, getting out of bed. When does it make sense to get out of bed? And I like thinking about things that make it easier. If I know that, okay, in general, once I'm really awake, get out of bed as quickly as possible. It's just thinking about, okay, how do I do that? Like, kind of what's the easiest way? And then it might require some willpower, but I still want it to be what's the easiest way instead of the hardest way to do it. Now, with something like writing, so there are all kinds of things. And so it's just a way of, it's just, my own examples aren't going to be that helpful. But one thing I find, and I've been playing with more lately, is when I read good stuff in my field. So I'm working on a book on energy, and when I read good energy / environmental thinking, or listen to it the night before, or sometimes on a Sunday or the weekend before I'm writing, because I'm not usually writing on weekends, I find that really charges me up. Like if I can, particularly if I have I learn a new idea, then I've just learned one last week. If you listen to my podcast, Power Hour, with a guy named Patrick Moore, a really interesting ecologist, and he talks about human beings being tropical creatures and like how our bodies are ideally suited for the deep tropics. And that has implications for how you think about different kinds of climate changes. And I just thought, oh, this is so fascinating. Now I want to go think about that, or learn some new fact about energy economics. And then it's motivating to go. That's just for me, that any kind of new idea just is very, that is a condition that makes it easier to get started. And and the nice thing is it's super easy for me to read other people's ideas about things. I don't always do it by default, but I always enjoy it. So if I think, okay, yeah, I'm not feeling like, no, I'm not sure about going into this week, I feel a little bit disconnected. Okay, then I'll just read something good. And then that starts to charge me up. Now, I should emphasize that writing can be an example of this, where it really needs to be the easiest way. Part of easiest way to get started is it actually needs to lead to getting started quickly, because one can do things that are preparatory, but that end up in being procrastination. So you don't want procrastination at all. You want something that's a fairly direct path. So there's, I'm a big Seinfeld fan. And on one of the shows, I think it's I'm embarrassed that I can't remember I think it's the show, the Cheever Letters in season 4. This happens, I think, across a couple episodes, but I think this is the main one, where they're supposed to write a script for a pilot, and they just like keep finding ways to delay it. And it's like, oh, I got to find George Costanza in particular is is doing this, and like finding the right kind of pen, and there might be something about sitting in the right place, but there's all these different things, and it's clearly not actually engaging the brain and putting pen to paper, which is what actually has to happen. So do not take away at all the idea that, oh, well, maybe like I'm just going to come up with a bunch of rituals that make it easier, but then it delays it and I don't have to pull the trigger. It's much more, how do I quickly get into it? So for something like the reading of other things, that's the kind of thing I would do the night before something rather than right before. That's at least how it works for me, because I find that if I'm like, it's good to charge me up and to give me motivation and to give me material to work with. But because it's so easy to read compared to write and to create something, at least for me, then if I try to do it right before, it's easy to get sucked into it and into the reading and saying, oh, I'll just take some more notes and, oh, this is going to be useful. And then before I know it, an hour and a half has passed, and then I'm not writing. So I have to be super, super aware of that. But for example, something that does work for me well is just taking a little walk and talking out loud about the thing I'm going to write, and any questions or challenges I have about it, just talking about that. So I could say a lot more about writing in particular, but just the idea is, again, what is the easiest way to get started on this so that it will happen? And then a lot of that is knowing at what point in the activity does it become easy to sustain, and then how to get to that part as quickly as possible. And one other question that you can ask is what makes it harder to get started on this? So there can be certain things that can easily get in the way of things. So one thing for me for writing is just amount of time elapsed in the morning. I find that the more time elapses in the morning, if I do a really long morning routine, I find that it makes it harder for me to get started. So then I can think about, okay, well, maybe I want to if I was eating in the morning, even before that, I would just get started on it a little bit, or take a little. I think Ayn Rand had this term actually. I'm not sure. I think I heard it secondhand from someone else, but small glances. So it's like taking a little look at it, or thinking about it, maybe looking at a draft or looking at an outline, just starting to get it working without the immediate obligation of having to create something. But for me, an obstacle is definitely time elapsed. And that's one reason actually I got really interested in Wim Hof stuff, was doing that breathing plus the cold shower, that plus just taking a quick walk. And I take my dog out in the morning anyway. That's a really quick way to get started. I was finding with other things I was doing that were taking longer, it would just be, okay, hour and a half, and it's good, but it's also just a little bit long. So that question, what makes it harder to get started on, is also valuable. So that's the main thing I wanted to focus on. So just to recap, there's these different ways of getting started when it's difficult. So there's habit formation, willpower, condition setting, and then this is engineering the activity to be easier to start. But there is one more that I've referenced a couple times, and so that's the fifth one, and that is proper time allocation. So the thing is easier to get started if it has a certain amount of time allocated to it. I think it's an amount of time where I'm confident the thing is doable, and even I'm confident it's doable if I have a small delay. So I mentioned 2 hours I find to be a really good amount of time. Now for working on a book, it's a little low, but even there I can still do a section or two. I can do something meaningful. For consulting projects, I can certainly do it, or for anything media related, or I could do a podcast and a newsletter in that amount of time. So 2 hours for me, that's a really nice chunk of time. And even if something happens, there's a delay, for 15 minutes, okay, I still have an hour and 45 minutes. Whereas if I allocate just an hour and then 15 minutes gets delayed, that it's just so easy to just get derailed, and then who knows what's going to happen in that time, but not usually anything good. So I find that having it's not exactly a generous amount of time, but a slightly more than sufficient amount of time to do the task makes it a lot easier to get into, because I know that I can really do it. And it in part removes that excuse of, oh, well, I'm not going to have enough time, maybe put it till later. That's that kind of thinking. The tomorrow Alex will not be very happy with me if I engage in a lot of that kind of thinking. Another one about easier to get started is there's just different kinds of little mental tricks of just saying, okay, I'm just going to work on this for 10 minutes. So that's one I think I've mentioned on a previous episode, but that can be one way of doing it too. Like, okay, it's easier to get started if I think, okay, I got 10 minutes and then I'm just going to do that. And then we'll see what happens. And then, okay, 10 minutes, you're going to be into the thing. So it's whatever, this is going to vary a lot from person to person, but I think almost all of us have activities where for various reasons they can be difficult to get started. And even it can be just an issue of transition, where if I'm doing different kinds of activities during the day, it's hard to switch from one context to another. And so it can be, and I get really into one thing and then I need to do another thing. And it can be, this thing is so new and it's so big and I'm not into it right now. So I just figure out, how do I really elegantly get into this thing? All right. That is all for today. Hope that you got something out of that. And I hope that if you have any insights about this or any questions, you can share them on the Facebook page at facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. Or as I like to say, you can email me with any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail at alex@alexepstein.com. You can sign up for updates for this show, which usually comes out every 2 weeks at humanflourishingproject.com. And if you like this show, definitely, actually it'd be nice if you would leave a review on iTunes. I know we have a lot of those. I guess it's Apple Podcasts now. So leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcasting platform if you happen to consume it then, and definitely recommend it to other people. I know this show has a lot of loyal fans. It doesn't have a huge number of fans, in part because I don't promote it as widely as I may in the future, but you can help promote it by just referring people to the show and tell them what your favorite episodes are, and maybe they will find value from it as well. One final note. This may be my last show. No, don't worry. Before I turn 40, I'm going to be 40 on August 1st. And so I'm tentatively planning on recording an episode on August 2nd, but I may do one next week if I have some sort of, if I want to do some sort of pre-turning 40 show. But if I do not do that, I'll just say that thanks everybody for listening. This show started, I believe I recorded the first episode on August 1st on my birthday in 2018. So it's been 2 years. I've certainly learned a ton by doing this show. I've met a lot of really interesting people through this show. And even with people that I already knew, developed my relationships with them in really cool ways, just based on some of the topics on this show. So I've definitely enjoyed doing it and enjoyed interacting with everybody. So thanks for all of the support and enthusiasm and good ideas. And I look forward to doing a lot more of this in the next decade of my life. So that is it for this week. I will be back probably in 2 weeks, maybe 1 week, but in either case, until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.